Hello everybody, welcome to this Sigma-HSE webinar on how to build a sustainable process safety management and leadership culture. I'm hoping that you're having a good day, whether it's the morning or the afternoon at this present time. My name's Andy Fowler. I'll be with you throughout this next hour or so. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm currently the Technical and Operations Director at Sigma-HSE, but you can see from this slide my experiences. So I've worked for the past 40 years now in major hazard industries, and the last 15 or so in training and consultancy. So I've trained a lot of people around the world, especially senior executives and boards of directors in this subject of process safety, and I hope to be able to give you an insight into some of that this morning. I've also worked for 17 years as a process safety specialist inspector and risk assessor within the UK's health and safety executive. So lots of experience. There's not many processes that I've actually not seen. Just a little introduction to Sigma-HSE. We're a process safety consultancy, global company with offices around the place, including India, and we opened up a new office in the States last year over in Massachusetts. But we also have the luxury of being a process safety testing laboratory as well. So we were able to test substances for their fire, explosion and electrical properties, which is very key in trying to prevent fires and explosions, of course. So without that knowledge, it's a bit difficult to be able to make sure that your processes that you design and operate are as safe as they could be from the point of view of preventing fires and explosions. So of course, as a consultancy, you'd expect us to be able to do all the things that process safety requires, and in the next few slides I'll explain just what process safety is as opposed to occupational safety, because it's been around a long time, but there has been a great deal of effort, particularly in Europe, following on from major incidents such as the Buncefield event in the UK, where we simply overfilled a tank of petrol, but it found a source of ignition, and that was the biggest peacetime explosion in the UK. And in the same year, there was BP Texas City, where they managed to overfill a distillation column, basically, and that resulted in large numbers of people unfortunately being killed. So following on from those things, particularly in the UK, there was a big effort to managing process safety, reinvigorating process safety, making sure that the job is done correctly. So all the things that you know and love around HAZOPs and LOPERS and process safety, risk management systems and all of that, we'll cover in a sense today. But I just wanted to get over really a few topics that I'd like you to think about, especially once I've stopped talking and you go back to your own job, is, just what is process safety? How can I make improvements in process safety on my site? And I'm going to give you some things to ponder about, with the primary focus being around understanding behaviours and leadership. Okay, because all of these things are important. Our processes are all designed and operated and maintained by people. So unless they understand what they're playing with, what the hazards are, what precautionary measures you've got installed in your processes, without doing the right job, and importantly, without having the leadership that provides the resources and the focus to do this job properly, we won't necessarily have systems, processes that are as safe as they could be. So just what is process safety management? I mean, essentially process safety is around preventing disasters, catastrophes, big events, fires, explosions, toxic gas releases, things that have got the potential, if they occur, of doing a lot of damage, hurting a lot of people or killing people, damaging the environment, significantly damaging a business. You know, if you want an idea of this, just pull up the share price of a company like BP over time, and when you see a large drop in their share performance, you'll be able to equate that for when they've had a major incident, whether that's BP Texas City or the Macondo Gulf of Mexico event and so on. You'll see the impact it can have on a business. Okay, so we're trying to prevent these things. But in a nutshell, really, process safety management can be evaluated following these three simple questions, really. Do we understand what can go wrong? If we don't know what can happen, if we don't know the impact of our processes if they go wrong, it's a little bit very difficult to be able to design the processes to prevent these things from happening. And believe me, in all the training that I've done over the years with boards of directors and things, they don't really understand the impact of some of the processes that they're currently operating with. Within the UK, major hazard sites which have the potential to have these large fires, explosions and toxic gas releases, have a particular set of regulations called the COMA regulations, similar in the States with their PSM focus and so on and so forth. But what's it mean in practice? You know, does the board of directors really understand? And I can tell you that from the training that I've done with boards of directors and senior executives, although the company may have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds creating safety reports to put in front of the regulator, that these senior people haven't necessarily read this. And very often when I've done training, I've actioned these people to get hold of these reports and read them. And they've come back to me in the fullness of time and said, you know, Andrew, I didn't realise we could have this potential. Nobody had told me that we had potential scenarios on the processes that we operate that could kill 200 people or could cause significant environmental damage. They just weren't aware of it. So, you know, do we understand what can go wrong? Then, of course, we can put in place procedures, precautionary measures and so on to prevent those things from going wrong. And many of these, particularly many of the pieces of safety critical equipment that we adopt, that we install on our processes to manage these hazards and reduce the level of risk, ideally they should never operate because they're set at the limits of our processing operations. We need to understand what happens when we go beyond these limits, when we have these so-called process safety excursions. So we have these pieces of these protective measures, but how do we know that they're effective? How do we really know that they're going to work on the day when they need to work? So just to put a bit more meat on the answers to these questions, you know, the first one, do we understand what can go wrong? This is where we need a full understanding, where we've got to use very robust and systematic methodologies to identify our hazards. Because if the methodologies that we use to identify hazards aren't as good as they should be, and we miss some hazards, of course, then we won't build any protective measures into our systems and processes to be able to protect ourselves from those hazards. So that's when we'll use techniques such as hazard, HAZOP, LOPA, etc. And we may have to do some what's called extent and severity determination, some consequence modelling, to take the processes through theoretically what could happen and see what the impact is. Okay, so we have those things to gain our understanding. And then for the second question, what I will do, once we've identified those hazards of what can go wrong, then we'll put in place measures. Now, these can be pieces of equipment, or they can in fact be tasks or even management systems that we use to prevent, control and mitigate those things that can go wrong. So hopefully, although we've determined how bad things could be, we put in place measures to try and stop those bad things from happening, or that we control and mitigate them so they're not as bad as they could be. We take action. So what we're doing really is reducing the likelihood of these hazards. Okay. Now, of course, because these special pieces of equipment and special tasks that we do, this is where the process safety management system comes in. That's got to be properly implemented. So if we've got a piece of equipment that is there to prevent a release of a highly flammable gas or a toxic material, then of course we need to make sure that that piece of equipment has been properly designed, has been properly constructed, properly installed, is properly operated, inspected and maintained throughout what we call the process safety life cycle. Have we designed it correctly? Have we installed it correctly? Is it operated properly? Do we look at it occasionally to find out if it's still fit for purpose and so on, and maintain it? That in a nutshell is the whole process safety life cycle. So we'll have these measures in place that we need to look after. But as I say, ideally these measures should never operate in anger. Okay, so we need, how do we know that these protective measures are going to be effective? Well, this is basically how the organization learns. So when things have gone wrong, when we've had some incidents or we've had near misses, how do we investigate those to find the root causes of the event and so on? Audits that we undertake aimed at finding the gaps in our systems, the gaps in the equipment that we have, the gaps in the management systems, management review, and of course performance measurement, metrics. Have we got hard numerical information that tells us that these things are performing correctly? So it's how the organization learns. Okay, now it's important to say just two critical things there, that these two critical points that I've put up here. Process safety management isn't just about the equipment, it isn't just about the processing plant itself. There's a lot of engineering involved, but there's also this blend of engineering and management skills. Yeah, because it's people who design equipment, it's people that operate them and so on. And every stage of the process safety life cycle has got human involvement, hopefully by competent staff who understand and can, answer those three questions. But of course, it's all topped and tailed by a commitment to do the correct thing. It's a commitment of the organisation to design things to the right standard, to operate them correctly, to make sure that the operators follow the procedures, that we don't let maintenance slip, so we don't maintain our plant and so on. And this is all the subject of the leadership, this commitment to do the right thing. And we all know that leaders are important people, yeah, and staff will tend to bend over backwards to satisfy the leaders. There's many occasions when everybody knows that production output is important to the leaders, there's lots of evidence to suggest that people will take off the safety precautions so they can run the plant faster and so on. Okay. And that's happened on a lot of cases, and people have gone to jail because of that. Okay, and people have died because of that, because with that focus, that commitment from the leadership to do the right thing. Yes, productivity, but also safety, and especially process safety, needs to be a major focus. Now, to help you set up your process safety system, there are some published frameworks out there, and two of them, one of them is the CCPS guidelines, which has been published by the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, and that's built around what's known as 4 process safety pillars and contains 20 elements within those 4 pillars. And there's also one specific to the UK Energy Institute, which is essentially identical. They've just changed some of the words. So instead of having pillars, they have focused areas, and they've combined a couple of the elements. So there's less elements, there's 18 elements. But what's this mean? You know, if we look at these frameworks in a little bit more detail, the first pillar in the CCPS guidelines is titled Leadership and Culture, and there's 5 elements in there. It's around the culture of the organisation, that there's compliance with the standards. Now, these standards may be ISO standards or British standards. There could equally be regulations, national regulations, or they could in fact just be internal standards, standards that your organisation itself has developed. There's an element about process safety competence. And this isn't really, when we generally talk about competence, we talk about the competence of people, the competence that a job can be done correctly and understood properly. This element is really focused on the organisational competence, the competence of your business to not have fires, explosions and toxic releases that can do a lot of harm. Okay? And it's understood as part of that leadership and culture guideline that there's a lot of people that are involved in making this happen. And that's why there's an element on workforce engagement. Yeah, so it's not just creating tablets of stone, which everybody then just falls into line and follows those tablets of stones, those rules. It's making sure that people can raise the issues, that can see action being taken to make things better, and so on and so forth. And similarly, there's people outside of the organisation are interested in how the business is running, whether that's the regulators, whether that's your shareholders. You know, your shareholders don't want to be putting money into a business that keeps having fires and explosions and spending money fixing things after events. It wants you to have a sustainable business. Okay, so that's the first pillar. The second one is around understanding hazards and risk, how we go about identifying our hazards and carrying out risk assessment. But there's also an element here about knowledge management. Once you've done that work, how do you keep it within the business? And many businesses find this difficult because that knowledge is within a few individuals. And if those individuals leave, the organisation then suddenly finds that it doesn't really understand why that piece of equipment is set at the setting that it's set at. It's not quite sure what it's there to do, okay, because that person who had that knowledge has left or moved on, retired or whatever. So there's elements there. The next element is the managing risk pillar. And of course, this is where lots of your policies and procedures within your existing health and safety management system will be operable. Yeah, so do we have operating procedures, permit to work for safe working practices, looking after our assets, and so on and so forth, management of change. Okay, and then the fourth pillar, we've got learning from investigation, how we carry out investigations, how do we learn, what is our performance measurements and metrics telling us, what is the audits telling us, and then is it occasionally reviewed by the senior management that the whole system as a holistic view is working as it's intended to work. because one of the facets of process safety improvement is we're supposed to be in continuous improvement mode. We're supposed to be actively looking for the gaps in our systems and understanding and filling them. Not filling them, not just waiting until something's happened and then going in to find out why and then making changes to the plant. So process safety management is very much about being proactive, having a proactive system to do this sort of work. Being proactive, actively looking for these gaps in the systems, actively filling these gaps. And you can see the Energy Institute guidelines. Again, they're 4 focused areas, slightly different words, but effectively the same. Number 1, leadership. Number 2, risk assessment. Number 3, risk management and review and improvement. Okay, and you can tell that ignoring the leadership one that's there on the top of the list, the other 3 are simply those 3 simple questions I posed at the start. Do we understand what can go wrong? Do we know what measures we've got in place? And how do we know they're going to be effective? And one thing you can all take from this, I'd be very happy if when you next go back out onto your plant doing an inspection or just walking around and looking at a piece of equipment, if you ask yourselves those 3 questions, do I know what can go wrong here? Do I know what measures are installed to protect us from those things going wrong? How do I know? How do I know that they're going to be effective? And process safety is about having this constant vigilance to keep asking these questions, keep trying to get the evidence to satisfy yourself that you do know, that you are aware, okay, and that it's working effectively. So a lot of it is around the process safety management system, the pieces of paper, the policies and procedures that we write down. Okay, and that in a sense is the easiest thing to do, to get somebody to sit down and say, this is how we're going to manage asset integrity. This is how we're going to do management of change. And there's plenty out there in the literature already that'll tell you whether your management of change system is good, bad, or indifferent, for example. But the trick is there's a lot to it. There's an awful lot of work to these 20 elements. So creating those is important, very, very important, but the organization needs to fully understand how it all fits together. And that is something which we need to change, because as you'll be aware, most of us exist in our own little silos. Yeah, we silo manage. We're not really interested in the big picture. Here, with our process safety management system, with all its policies and procedures, is in a sense a very big bag of spaghetti. And we need to untangle that. Somebody within the business, and lots of people within the business, needs to draw those, how it all links together to create a holistic system. But having pieces of paper, having policies and procedures is important, but they need to be implemented well. And this is, in my experience, where many companies fail. That the procedures are there, but they're not necessarily understood. They're not followed. Yeah, and very often they're not followed because they're not a workable solution. Okay, and there's other pressures placed on people to not necessarily do it the right way, do it the way that the policies and procedures expect us to work, because we have all of those outside pressures if we need to do something quickly. Because most of you, all of you, will have the mantra in your organizations to satisfy the client, will bend over backwards to do what the client wants as quickly and simply as possible. And basically, we're building a system here that prevents us from acting quickly if we want to do things correctly to make sure it's safe. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to satisfy ourselves that what we come up with is in fact safe. Okay, but it is important. It is important. Where I've seen this work well is where companies forget about what the legislation says they have to do, because of course that can be very, very dependent on where your manufacturing site is and what the national legislation is, if indeed there is any. But it's where the companies set the system. It's where the company decides what is it that we're trying to achieve with respect to process safety, and making its policies fix holistically with what they require of the business, okay, rather than just satisfying the legislation. It's part of being in this continuous improvement mode, not just doing what the law says, but actively trying to reduce the risks throughout our business. And that's where we'll get a sustainable business from, if we're in control, if we understand, if we can do the correct job. Just to go focus now on leadership a little bit, because if you pull up after the BP Texas City event and there was the Baker panel set up there of all the experts and what have you that looked over and raised recommendations for the industry, one of the things that they were found very lacking was that there wasn't clear and positive process safety leadership. And of course, without this leadership, you're not going to get the resources to do it properly. They're not going to set the culture for you to do it properly. And of course, this needs to mean that right at the very top of the organisation, that they're involved in this, that they set the standard for the business. Okay? And to be able to do that correctly, they need some level of competence in the subject of process safety. They need to have an overview of all this bag of spaghetti and what it's doing for the business. And of course, they've also got to make it happen by example. We as people, were led by our leaders if they set the same example. So it's all right having the tablets of stones, the policies and procedures, but if leadership is tantalizing you with trying to do things differently and working around these things, you won't have the right culture. And to be able to do this, they need to get out and they need to convince you that process safety is important to them. If you're convinced that process safety is an important aspect of your leadership, it'll become an important aspect for the way you work, okay? Because that's what the business, that's what your leadership, that's what your organization is expecting, and it's giving you the resources and so on and so forth to be able to do that in practice. But you know, they can't do this by sitting in the boardroom. They need to get out and they need to talk. This workforce engagement, this stakeholder engagement, that you're convincing people, everybody who's got an interest in this business, of doing it correctly. So, you know, just what is leadership? What's the difference between leadership and management, for example? So leadership is taking an holistic view. Where do we want this business to be? Going beyond a year. You know, where do we want to be in 10 years' time? Where do we want to be in 5 years' time? How are we going to achieve that? How are we going, for example, going to develop a process safety management system and make it work for us? Let me give you an example here. Many businesses start on, say, if you were to analyse your accident and near-miss statistics, many of the things that organisations do is ask people to report things that are wrong, that are not quite right, okay? And if you were to analyse all of those big pieces of data that many of your companies will do, you'll find that many of the issues that are raised are to do with occupational safety, slips and trips and falls and things like that. They're not necessarily focused on process safety. So if you do set on the road to increase your process safety awareness in the business and have this process safety focus, then if whatever you're doing to pass that information on, to see the working practices change, to get people focused towards process safety, obviously one measure of how successful you're being is if the ratio of process safety to occupational safety, near misses and things that are reported to you changes. So it's people stop looking for occupational safety issues and start looking for process safety related issues, many of which will be associated with losing control of your manufacturing processes, having losses of containment of dangerous substances and this sort of thing. Yeah. The focus for this should be looking for value maximization, keeping the business sustainable rather than just profit maximization. And we've all seen that in the past throughout the 80s and 90s and even into the noughties and so on, where businesses focused on profit maximization, short-term gains, and we all saw all the job losses in the industry and everything else that came as a part of that. It's pretty easy to take money out of a business. It's not that easy to ensure that you get value maximization. And you get that value maximization by understanding and controlling and managing. So, setting this strategic vision, making sure that you're providing the appropriate resources to do it and so on, can really influence performance. This is where leadership can have such a great impact on this subject of process safety. And it's different to management. Managers generally have these tactical goals, which are related to the annual plans. This is what we're trying to achieve this year and so on and so forth. It's less holistic. It's more putting us into our silo management again. So that, part of the leadership is trying to get this thing called a process safety culture, getting people to think about process safety, getting people to answer those three questions. And I've given a couple of definitions of culture here. One is from the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, and you can see there's nothing wrong with that definition. It covers all the areas you'd expect it to be: individual and group values, attitudes, competencies and patterns of behaviour that determine the commitment to the organisation's health and safety program. This doing the right things and providing the resources to doing the right things. I much prefer the second one, how the organisation behaves when no one's watching. Obviously operators will follow the procedures when they've got a manager looking at them to see if they do actually follow the procedures. But what happens during the night shift when there's no management and that? Do people still take the correct actions? Do people still behave accordingly? So let's just have a little look now at what bit deeper into what culture is, because it's one of these nebulous things. It's important and you can see it when it happens, but it's a bit, it's difficult to really get a grip on. Have we got a good process safety culture or not? So, I'm a consultancy and I've worked with a lot of organizations in process safety throughout the years. But if you as an organization said, Andy, can you come in and increase our process safety culture? And I'd say, well, that's a bit difficult to do. And the reason it's difficult to do is because culture is built up from people's attitudes. Well, okay, then come in and look at what our people's attitudes are. And I said, well, I can't really do that either, really, because attitudes come about from people's behaviours, the actions that they take, the way they behave. Well, okay, come and have a look at that then, see how people behave. And I said, well, I could do that, but effectively I'd have to look at each individual, and you really wouldn't want to pay me the vast amount of money that would be required to look at the behaviour of all your individuals within the business. The reason why it's difficult are these are outcomes. People's behaviours, people's attitudes, and the culture of the organisation are outcomes. They're what happens once we've put the inputs in. And the inputs are these three things on the left-hand side of this slide. Do we have good systems and processes? Is our process safety management system effective? Are the policies and procedures fit for purpose? Do people actually operate the plant and maintain the plant and carry out the investigations as fully as they should be for all those 20 elements? Is that working? So this is why the process safety management system is important, because it's one of the major inputs. You've set the standard with every one of those pieces of paper of what you expect people within your organisation to do, the steps they need to go through to determine that the processes that you're operating are going to be safe and you're not going to have fires, explosions, toxic gas releases doing a lot of harm. You also need good targets and objectives. There's this vision set by the leadership, this vision, this longer term targets and objectives. What are you going to do? What's your objectives to actually generate a process safety culture? What is it that you're going to do? How are you going to go about doing this? It all comes down to best accepted management practices, really, the plan, do, check, act. You know, plan to do something, check that it's being successful. If it's not, change it, take action, and review it all the time. But the major element of the inputs, where when you're changing culture, is this third element of coaching and mentoring. And this is where it's difficult for many organisations. There's nowhere near as much coaching and mentoring that goes on. A lot of businesses I've worked with have a system of where they set managers and individuals the tasks of going out and doing safety observations and things, specifically focused towards process safety. So trying to gauge by talking with employees and things, their understanding of why they're doing things in a certain way, why they're asked to do things in a certain way. Do they understand what can go wrong? You know, are they able to speak and answer around those three questions? Do we know what can go wrong? What have we got to protect ourselves? How do we know we're effective? Many organisations have this system, and managers go out, and on the whole, what tends to happen is that they look for people doing things incorrectly, not following the procedure or walking past something that's clearly wrong, and so on and so forth, and then having a conversation about, well, why haven't you done this? Why have you done it a different way? And so on and so forth. So they tend to be very negatively focused, looking for things that people are doing wrong. Good coaching and mentoring looks for things that are doing that you're seeing are doing well. Yeah, and congratulating the operator for carrying out the process according to the procedure. But having these in-depth conversations around those three questions. You know, does the operator know what can go wrong? Is he well aware of the precautionary measures that are installed in the plant? Do they know how to operate those measures and when to operate those measures and what those measures will do? Yeah. So even when you do audits, this can be something that if you take that approach, you can really gauge awareness as to the understanding of process safety, You can come away with if you can have a meaningful discussion with a person operating a process and they're able to give good, clear explanations of why they do what they do, what's there to protect them, and so on and so forth, you'll come out with a nice warm glow that we're safe because this person understands. He can answer those 3 questions. So it's always best to look for the positiveness of coaching and mentoring. I can give you one example of many, but many of you, if you're on a large site, may have, every few years or something, a major period of downtime when you do a lot of changes to your plant and maintenance and things like this. And I worked with one client who that was coming up, and it was a major thing every 2 or 3 years, and they literally spent a team of people planning for sort of 2 years before the event was going to happen, where they were going to shut the plant down for 2 weeks, and they'd plan all of this out. And on this one occasion, they planned it out. They were going to shut the plant down on a Saturday morning and reopen it on the Monday morning 2 weeks later, because that was the plan. That was when everything should have been done. And on this occasion, the Thursday before the Monday morning, it was relayed back to management that we've done everything. We can start the plant back up on Saturday rather than wait till Monday. Now, you can imagine in many organisations, that's a great thing to be congratulated. This is where you might get a bigger bonus or an earlier bonus than you were anticipating or whatever. In this case, the management team said, well, why? We've spent 2 years planning for this, being told it'll take 14 days or whatever to do what we need, but we've finished 3 days early. So why? So they instigated a full investigation. What had happened that meant that we could start this plant up 3 days early? So those 3 days I spent investigating. As it turned out, serendipity was present really, and they hadn't done anything incorrectly. It just turned out that when they needed a piece of equipment, when they needed a crane to be there to move a large piece of equipment, it was there waiting. So they didn't have none of these lags that generally you'd have. Everything went totally smoothly. Okay, so it wasn't because we'd suddenly taken shortcuts or something of that ilk. It was more to do with by good fortune really, that when they needed something, it was all present, and so on and so forth. But it's fair to say in that business, they could answer those 3 questions extremely well. There was a lot of coaching and mentoring and so on going on. And that's really what the investigation was around. We've got the systems and processes for doing this shutdown. We had our targets and objectives, but there was an awful lot of coaching and mentoring and communication between individuals. So, how will you tell if you've set yourself out on this map of building a culture? How can you tell if it's working? Well, really, it's around going out and listening to people talking and what they're talking about. Yeah. And when you've got the culture, you'll find that individuals within businesses, process safety is very high on the agenda of the conversations they have between themselves. You will find within your own business that somewhere in the business, either consciously or subconsciously, you do understand the risks. Because these days, we do tend to have a good understanding of what can go wrong and what precautions we've built into things to make sure that those things don't go wrong. Yeah, because we have competent people and we've done a lot of process safety training and whatever. But it's around this engagement, it's around this listening. And I've gone to some companies where the culture has been so strong, almost you could view it as a bit of an annoyance, really, because every time you have a conversation, safety is part of that conversation. Yeah. And if you walk down the plant, you'll see people doing the things you'd expect them to do, not walking past something that is clearly wrong, not picking up that waste equipment and putting it in the correct location, not operating something that's held up with string and sticking plasters, yeah, but getting it fixed and doing it correctly. So it's all around this engagement and listening, and it's tough. Yeah, building a culture is tough, but it's having that commitment to do things properly, and it's having that commitment of the people that they see the benefit, they understand. Everybody in the business understands what can go wrong, what precautions you've got built in, and take the effort to learn at every opportunity to make sure that these things occur. Yeah, and it's about being proactive. Just think about now, what actually happens if you know that next week an auditor is coming on site to look at some process. What happens on site in reality? For many organisations, they see this as something that they need to pass, but they're well aware of things that they don't really want the auditor to find. Yeah, they're sweeping things under the carpet and hoping that the auditor doesn't unearth them. What I'm getting at is that your people will know which of your policies, procedures, and the ways of you work are not as good as they should be. They know what the gaps are. For some reason, and it's into psychology now, people tend to think we'll live with those gaps. And what you need is to get out of those gaps. We must find those gaps. We must actively go and find those gaps. And I often say to companies that what you need to do, you want all of your staff, when they pass through the gatehouse going out of the site, to get down on their hands and knees and they chant, I must find some gaps. I must find some gaps today. Because if I can find gaps, I can fix it. I can make it better. I can make that improvement. Yeah. And auditors can be very powerful here if you can direct them. If you can say, we know that this part of the system isn't working particularly well. We know that people find it difficult to actually work to this particular procedure or whatever. Go out and help us. Go out and help us how we can improve, what things we can try. And you'll get a lot more focused information then from your auditor going forward. One thing that has come out of the water in the past sort of 10 years is this concept of what's called a high reliability organisation. Now, it isn't something that you get a plaque on the wall like investors in people or you get a certificate for. It's not got to that level yet, but I'm sure it will. But in a sense, it's a philosophical way of approaching organisations which are inherently risky. Where you've got significant hazards, you can do a large amount of harm if your processes lose control. And this sort of depicts the sorts of focus for the organisation. And in a sense, it's a good way to think about things. So we start off with definition. So we understand with our definition of what can go wrong and what measures that we've got built in to protect ourselves from that, whether that's equipment or whether that's the management system. So that's well defined and well implemented. Okay. that allows us then, hopefully, to have a learning organisation where people do come each day to work and make that chanting of I must find the gaps, yeah, and try and being in continuous improvement mode, constantly trying to learn, constantly trying to reduce risks. If we get into those habits, then we'll end up with being able to anticipate problems. So the world of reacting to things that have happened becomes a lot less of a major factor within the way we operate our businesses, because proactively we're finding the gaps and proactively we're fixing those gaps. So we're anticipating the problems and we're fixing them. That means that because we're in risk land, of course, we can do our best, but bad things can still happen. But with this knowledge and understanding, with this problem anticipation and learning culture, learning orientation and culture, if we do have events, we should be able to contain them. You know, it's this Rumfeld's known unknowns and unknown unknowns and this sort of thing. Those become a lot less of an issue to the business. And with a just culture, so I've put the words there, just culture. So what does a just culture mean? It basically means that everybody knows the standard. Yeah, and everybody, if they stray from that standard, is dealt with in the same way. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a senior manager or an operator on the shop floor, the same just culture applies. And all of this is tipped by mindful leaderships. So not just good leadership now, but mindful leadership. So what does mindful leadership mean? It basically means that the leadership fully understand how much harm they can do, and it's a constant, it's at the front of their mind constantly. It's very easy with process safety that you do these things called risk assessments. You spend a lot of time and effort and prove to yourself that the risks are so low, the residual risks are so low, that's the job done. We don't need to bother about it anymore. Yeah, this is just not, although the risk is low, the hazards are still there. An example, in the UK we have what's called the National Lottery. So every week there's a draw done, and if you're very, very lucky, you can win the jackpot of a few £1,000,000. So the consequences of winning the jackpot, very severe. You know, life-changing amounts of money. You can leave the company, buy a yacht and go sailing around Bermuda and all of this sort of stuff. Life-changing events, okay? But the likelihood of winning the jackpot lottery, currently about 1 in 14 million. So it's a very low probability. But what's that mean? You know, what's that mean in hard terms? Well, in the UK, if you were a man over 40 and you bought your lottery ticket on Saturday at noon, you're actually more likely, by the time the draw's pulled on Saturday evening at 8 p.m, you're actually more likely of dying from a heart attack than you are of winning that jackpot. So it's a very low probability, but it can still happen. Yeah, and it's very easy for businesses to justify the level of risk and in a sense forget about it. Yeah, but sometimes you can hit that jackpot, and mindful leaders are aware that sometimes we can hit that jackpot, and it's the last thing that they want to happen. They don't want to win that jackpot, because if they win that jackpot, they may not have a business to come back to the day after the event. So it's this constant focus and putting in place the vision that that's not going to happen, with the good systems and culture targets and objectives set, and this mentoring, this constantly finding out what people believe. Do they believe the right things, in a sense? Do they do things correctly? And so on and so forth. So at that point, I'm going to end now. Hopefully it's given you something to think about. We're here to help. We've got lots of experience as a business in helping clients go through this bag of spaghetti and pull what's out important and make these improvements, and how to make these improvements effectively. We've done it with global businesses. So if you've got any questions, you'd like us to help, then the easiest way, give us a call, send an email to info@sigma-hse.com, as is on this slide, and hopefully we can work together to make these improvements. So on that end, I'll wish you a good end to the rest of the working day. Hope you have a nice, relaxing and peaceful weekend, and say goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.